Chapter 1. The Invitation to Thornfield Manor. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of St. Mary Mead, wrapping the village in a quiet gossamer shroud. Miss Jane Marple sat by her window, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked, on a pale blue shawl. The rhythm of her needles was as steady as her thoughts, which often wandered to the small dramas of village life. Mrs. Price's wayward nephew, the curious affair of the missing post. But today her mind was interrupted by the sharp rap of the postman's knock. She set her knitting aside and rose, her movements precise despite her age. At the door she found a single envelope, its heavy cream paper embossed with a crimson wax seal. The seal bore a curious emblem, a chalice entwined with thorns. Miss Marple's keen eyes narrowed as she broke the seal and unfolded the letter. Within, "Dear Miss Marple, your reputation for discernment precedes you. I cordially invite you to Thornfield Manor for an exclusive wine-tasting event on the 15th of October. The occasion promises rare vintages and rarer company, with an unveiling of a relic of great historical significance. Your presence would greatly enrich our gathering. A car will collect you at noon. Yours sincerely, Lord Edgar Ravenswood." Miss Marple's lips pursed. She had never met Lord Ravenswood, nor heard of Thornfield Manor, which the enclosed map placed some 30 miles north, deep in the moors. The invitation was polite, yet oddly impersonal, lacking the warmth of a personal acquaintance. And that seal, the chalice and thorns, stirred a faint memory, though she could not place it. She returned to her chair, picking up her knitting but not resuming her work. Instead, she gazed out at the mist, her mind turning over the letter's words. An exclusive event, a relic, and a host she did not know. It was, she decided, most intriguing. Miss Marple was no stranger to the undercurrents of human nature, and this invitation carried the faintest ripple of something amiss. By noon on the appointed day, she was ready, dressed in her best tweed suit, her hat pinned neatly in place. A sleek black car arrived, its driver a taciturn man with a scar above his left brow. He spoke little, merely confirming her name before opening the door. As the car wound through the fog-draped countryside, Miss Marple observed the landscape shift from familiar fields to wild, desolate moors. The manor, when it finally appeared, loomed like a shadow against the grey sky. A sprawling Gothic pile of weathered stone, its towers jagged as broken teeth. The driver stopped at the iron gates, which creaked open as if reluctant. Miss Marple stepped out, her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of moss and decay. Before her, the manor's great oak doors stood ajar, and a figure waited in the threshold. A tall man with silver hair and eyes that gleamed with an unsettling intensity. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice smooth as polished wood, "I am Lord Ravenswood. Welcome to Thornfield Manor." She smiled, her expression mild, but her eyes were sharp, taking in every detail. The man's immaculate suit, the faint tremor in his hand, the way his gaze lingered a fraction too long. Something, she thought, was not quite right. As she crossed the threshold, the doors closed behind her with a soft final thud, and Miss Marple felt the unmistakable prickle of a mystery taking root. "Hold on, detective, before we proceed. Reveal your location. Where are you uncovering these dark truths? Comment below. And if you dare to dive deeper into the shadows, subscribe now. Tomorrow's case plunges into even deeper darkness. Stay vigilant. Chapter 2. The Eccentric Guests. The grand hall of Thornfield Manor was a cavern of shadows and opulence, its high ceilings lost in gloom. A chandelier, dripping with crystal, cast flickering light across walls adorned with portraits of stern-faced ancestors. Miss Marple stood just inside, her hands clasped neatly, as Lord Ravenswood gestured toward a parlour where the other guests were gathered. The air was thick with the scent of polished wood and something sharper, perhaps anticipation. "Allow me to introduce you," Lord Ravenswood said, leading her forward. His smile was polished, but Miss Marple noted the way his eyes darted toward the parlour door, as if expecting something to emerge. The parlour was smaller, but no less grand, its walls lined with velvet drapes the colour of claret. A fire crackled in a marble hearth, and around a long mahogany table sat the guests, their faces turning as Miss Marple entered. There were 7, excluding herself, and each, she sensed, was a piece in a puzzle she had yet to assemble. Lord Ravenswood made the introductions with practised ease. First was Dr. Felix Moreau, a wiry Frenchman with a goatee and spectacles that magnified his restless eyes. He was, Ravenswood explained, a historian of occult artefacts, his fingers twitching as he clutched a leather notebook. Miss Marple noted the ink stains on his cuffs, recent and smudged, as if he'd been writing in haste. Next was Lady Beatrice Harlow, a statuesque woman in her 50s, her silver-blonde hair swept into an elegant chignon. Her emerald gown was exquisite, but her smile was tight, and her hands, adorned with heavy rings, gripped her wine-glass fraction too tightly. "A collector of rare vintages," Ravenswood said, to which Lady Harlow gave a curt nod. Mr. Julian Crane, a young man with sharp cheekbones and a nervous laugh, was introduced as an art dealer with a penchant for medieval relics. His suit was tailored but slightly rumpled, and his eyes flicked toward the door every few seconds, as if expecting an escape. Miss Clara Voss, a pale woman with jet-black hair and a voice like a whisper, was a poet, though Ravenswood added vaguely that she had an interest in ancient rituals. She wore a high-necked dress of midnight blue, and her gaze, when it met Miss Marple's, was unnervingly direct. Colonel Rupert Blake, a retired military man with a bristling moustache and a limp, sat ramrod straight. His weathered face spoke of campaigns in distant lands, but his eyes were clouded, as if haunted by more than war. He grunted in acknowledgment, his fingers drumming on the table. Mrs. Evelyn Dunlay, a plump widow with a penchant for lace and pearls, fluttered her fan as she was introduced. She was, Ravenswood said, a patron of historical societies, though her chatter about local gossip suggested a keener interest in scandal. Her laugh was loud, but her eyes were watchful. Finally, there was Mr. Silas Grimm, a gaunt man with hollow cheeks and a voice like gravel. A dealer in antiquities, he wore a black suit that seemed to absorb the light. His hands, gloved in thin leather, rested motionless, but Miss Marple caught the faintest tremor when Ravenswood mentioned the evening's centrepiece, a chalice. As the introductions concluded, a servant entered, bearing a tray of wine-glasses. The room fell silent, the fire's crackle the only sound. Miss Marple declined a glass, preferring to keep her wits sharp. but she watched the others. Dr. Moreau sipped cautiously. Lady Harlow swirled her wine without drinking, and Mr. Grimm stared at his glass as if it held a secret. Lord Ravenswood raised his own glass, his smile widening. "To our gathering," he said, "and to the unveiling of a relic that will astonish you all." Miss Marple's gaze swept the room, noting the tension in every face. A historian, a collector, an art dealer, a poet, a soldier, a gossip, an tuntured antiquarian, and herself, an unassuming spinster with a knack for seeing what others missed. The chalice, she thought, was more than a relic. It was a spark, and this room was a powder keg. As the firelight danced, she settled into her chair, her mild smile masking the certainty that trouble was already brewing. Chapter 3. The Chalice. Of legend, the parlour's heavy drapes seemed to muffle the world outside, as if Thornfield Manor existed in a pocket of time, untouched by the moor's restless wind. Miss Marple sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes moving from guest to guest. The air was charged, the earlier pleasantries giving way to a taut expectancy as Lord Ravenswood rose from his seat at the head of the table. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice resonant, "you were invited not merely for wine, but for a glimpse into history. A history steeped in mystery and, some say, peril." He paused, letting his words settle, and Miss Marple noted the flicker of unease in Colonel Blake's eyes, the way Miss Voss's fingers tightened around her pen. Ravenswood crossed to a velvet-lined case on a side table, its surface gleaming under the firelight. With a theatrical flourish, he opened it, revealing a chalice that seemed to draw the room's light into itself. It was ancient, its silver blackened with age, etched with thorns that twisted like veins. A single ruby, dark as congealed blood, was set at its base. The guests leaned forward, some with awe, others with something closer to dread. "This," Ravenswood said, lifting the chalice, "is the Chalice of Thornfield, said to date back to the 12th century. Legend claims it was forged for a knight, Templar, blessed by a saint and cursed by a heretic. Its most infamous tale is this: any wine poured into it, if drunk by one with sin in their heart, will turn to blood." A murmur rippled through the room. Mrs. Dunley gasped, her fan fluttering like a trapped bird. Dr. Moreau scribbled furiously in his notebook, muttering in French. Mr. Grimm's gloved hands clenched, and Miss Marple caught the faintest smirk on Lady Harlow's lips, as if she found the tale amusing, or knew more than she let on. "Poppycock," Colonel Blake grunted, though his voice lacked conviction. "Old wives' tales to scare children." "Perhaps," Ravenswood replied, his eyes glinting. "But the chalice has a history of vanishing, only to reappear when tragedy strikes. It was last seen a century ago, when my great-uncle died under peculiar circumstances." He set the chalice on the table, its ruby catching the firelight like a watchful eye. Miss Marple leaned forward, her expression one of polite curiosity, but her mind was racing. The chalice was exquisite, certainly, but its legend was a magnet for greed, fear, or vengeance. She studied the guests, Julian Crane's nervous fidgeting, Clara Voss's unblinking stare, Silas Grimm's stillness, which seemed almost predatory. Each, she suspected, had a reason to be here beyond mere curiosity. "Who's to drink from it, then?" Julian Crane asked, his laugh brittle. "Not me, I'm afraid. Too many youthful indiscretions." Ravenswood chuckled, but his gaze was sharp. "Fear not, Mr. Crane. Tonight we taste only wine. The chalice is for display, unless someone feels particularly bold." The tension broke as servants entered, bearing decanters of deep red wine. Glasses were filled, and the guests began to relax, their conversation turning to the vintage's bouquet and origin. Miss Marple declined a glass. Once more, her attention fixed on the chalice. It sat at the table's centre, untouched, yet it seemed to command the room. As the evening wore on, she noticed Dr. Moreau sketching the chalice in his notebook, his strokes quick and precise. Lady Harlow whispered something to Colonel Blake, who scowled in response. Miss Voss, meanwhile, was writing in a small journal, her lips moving silently, as if reciting a poem or a prayer. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden clink. Mrs. Dunlay, reaching for her glass, had knocked her spoon against the chalice. The sound was sharp, almost musical, and for a moment the room froze. Mrs. Dunlay laughed nervously. "Oh dear, how clumsy of me!" But Miss Marple's eyes were on the chalice, where a faint tremor seemed to ripple through the wine poured nearby, as if the metal itself had stirred. "Nonsense," she told herself, yet the prickle at the back of her neck told her otherwise. Chalice, she knew, was more than a relic. It was a catalyst, and the night was far from over. Chapter 4. The First Sip. The fire in the parlour had dwindled to embers, casting long shadows that danced across the faces of the guests. The wine-tasting had reached its peak, with the decanters nearly empty, and the conversation growing loose, though an undercurrent of unease lingered. Miss Marple sat quietly, her hands resting on her lap, her eyes never straying far from the chalice at the table's centre. Its ruby gleamed like a warning, and she sensed the room's mood teetering on the edge of something reckless. Lord Ravenswood, ever the charismatic host, rose once more, his glass raised. "To our final toast," he said, his voice rich with anticipation. "But before we conclude, I propose a small indulgence. Who among us is bold enough to drink from the chalice of Thornfield?" A ripple of nervous laughter broke the silence. Mrs. Dunley fanned herself vigorously, her eyes wide. "Oh, goodness, not I! My heart couldn't take it." Julian Crane shook his head, his fingers drumming on the table. Clara Voss's lips parted, but she said nothing, her gaze fixed on the chalice as if it whispered to her. "I'll do it," Colonel Blake declared, his voice gruff. He stood, his limp more pronounced as he crossed to the table. "All this talk of curses is nonsense. Let's put it to rest." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly. The Colonel's bravado was convincing, but she noted the sweat beading on his brow, the way his hand hesitated before grasping the chalice. Courage, she thought, or a need to prove something. Ravenswood's smile was enigmatic as he poured a measure of wine into the chalice, the liquid dark and viscous in the firelight. "Very well, Colonel. To your health." Blake raised the chalice, his eyes scanning the room as if daring anyone to object. The guests leaned forward, their breaths held. Miss Marple watched closely, her mind cataloguing every detail. Dr. Moreau's clenched jaw, Lady Harlow's sudden stillness, Silas Grimm's gloved hands folding tightly. The Colonel drank deeply, the chalice tilted high. For a moment, nothing happened. Then his face contorted, his free hand clutching his chest. The chalice slipped from his grip, clattering to the table, and a gasp rose as the remaining wine spilled, pooling on the cloth. It was red, vividly, impossibly red, like fresh blood. Blake staggered, his eyes wide with shock. It's true," he rasped before collapsing to the floor with a thud that shook the room. Chaos erupted. Mrs. Dunley screamed, her fan falling to the floor. Julian Crane leapt back, knocking over his chair. Dr. Moreau rushed to Blake's side, checking his pulse, while Clara Voss stood frozen, her journal slipping from her hands. Lady Harlow's expression was unreadable, though her fingers tightened around her glass. Silas Grimm remained seated, his face a mask, but Miss Marple caught the faintest glint in his eyes. Satisfaction, perhaps. "Stay calm." Ravenswood shouted, his voice cutting through the din. "Dr. Moreau, is he—" "Dead," Moreau said grimly, rising from the Colonel's side. "His heart, perhaps." Or he glanced at the chalice, its spilled contents staining the tablecloth. Miss Marple remained seated, her calm demeanour a stark contrast to the panic around her. She studied the scene. The chalice, now empty, its ruby glinting mockingly, the Colonel's body, his face frozen in horror. The guests each reacting in ways that revealed more than they intended. Poison, she thought, was the likely culprit, not a curse. But the theatrics of the blood-red wine suggested a mind that thrived on spectacle. "Lock the doors," she said softly, her voice carrying despite its gentleness. "No one should leave until we understand what has happened." Ravenswood hesitated, then nodded to a servant, who bolted the parlour doors. The guests turned to Miss Marple, some with suspicion, others with reluctant respect. She met their gazes with her usual mildness, but her mind was alight with questions. The chalice, the wine, the Colonel's bravado, each was a thread in a tapestry of deceit. As the fire's last embers flickered, Miss Marple knew one thing for certain. The curse, if it existed, was human in origin, and the killer was still in the room. Chapter 5. Whispers of murder. The parlour was stifling despite the chill seeping through Thornfield Manor's stone walls. Colonel Blake's body lay covered with a tablecloth, a makeshift shroud that did little to ease the tension. The locked doors trapped the guests in a cage of their own suspicions, and Miss Marple sat at the table's edge, her serene expression belying the sharpness of her observations. The chalice, now empty, stood like a silent accuser, its ruby glinting in the dim light. Lord Ravenswood paced, his earlier composure fraying. "This is a tragedy," he said, his voice strained. "But surely an accident, a weak heart, as Dr. Moreau suggested." "An accident?" Lady Harlow's tone was sharp, her emerald gown catching the firelight as she leaned forward. "That wine turned to blood, just as the legend warned. You saw it." "Nonsense," Dr. Moreau snapped, adjusting his spectacles. "A chemical trick, perhaps. Phenolphthalein, or some dye. I've seen such theatrics in my studies of alchemical frauds." His words were confident, but his hands trembled as he clutched his notebook. Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes on the spilled wine, now drying into a dark stain. A trick, perhaps, but one with deadly intent. She noted Mrs. Dunley's pale face, her fan abandoned as she whispered prayers. Julian Crane was pacing, muttering about curses, while Clara Voss sat motionless, her journal open but untouched. Silas Grimm, as ever, was a statue, his gloved hands folded, his gaze unreadable. "Poison," Miss Marple said softly, the word cutting through the room's clamour like a bell. All eyes turned to her, some shocked, others wary. The Colonel was healthy by his own account, and his collapse was sudden. The wine, or something in it, is the likely cause. "Poison?" Mrs. Dunley gasped, her hand flying to her pearls. "But we all drank the wine." "Not from the chalice," Miss Marple replied, her tone mild but firm. "Only Colonel Blake drank from it, and the wine was poured by Lord Ravenswood himself." Ravenswood froze, his face paling. "Are you accusing me, Miss Marple, dear?" "At all," she said, her smile disarming. "I merely observe. But we must consider who had access to the chalice and the wine, and who might have wished the Colonel harm." The room erupted in protests. Julian Crane pointed at Dr. Moreau, accusing him of knowing too much about chemicals. Lady Harlow snapped that Crane's nervous demeanour was suspicious. Clara Voss, speaking for the first time, murmured, "The chalice chooses its victims," her voice eerie, prompting Mrs. Dunley to cross herself. Miss Marple listened, letting the accusations fly. Each outburst was a window into motive and character. She recalled the Colonel's brusqueness, his dismissal of the curse. Had it offended someone? Or was his military past a clue? She made a mental note to inquire about his campaigns later. Stepping toward the chalice, she examined it without touching. The silver was tarnished, the thorns etched with precision, but there was no residue of powder or liquid beyond the wine's stain. The poison, if it was poison, was subtle, odourless, tasteless, swift. Her gaze shifted to the guests' reactions, Moreau's defensive scowl, Harlow's calculated silence, Grimm's unnerving calm. Someone must fetch the authorities. Colonel Blake's death demanded it, she thought, but the manor's isolation and the locked doors complicated matters. She turned to Ravenswood. "Is there a telephone?" He hesitated, then nodded. "In my study. I'll have a servant make the call." He gestured to a footman, who slipped out, the bolt clicking behind him. As the guests settled into uneasy silence, Miss Marple moved among them, offering gentle questions disguised as concern. To Mrs. Dunley she asked about the Colonel's demeanour during dinner. Irritable, it seemed, especially toward Grimm. To Julian Crane she inquired about the chalice's value. "Priceless," he stammered, but his eyes darted to Lady Harlow. Each answer was a thread, and Miss Marple was already weaving. By the time the servant returned, reporting the police delayed by a storm on the moors, Miss Marple had a clearer picture. The Colonel's death was no accident, and the chalice was both weapon and lure. Someone in this room had planned this, and she suspected the night's horrors were far from over. As the fire sputtered, casting long shadows, she caught Silas Grimm watching her, his eyes like dark wells. She met his gaze with her usual mildness, but her heart quickened. The game, she knew, had only just begun. Chapter 6. The Locked Room. The parlour's air grew heavier, thick with suspicion, and the faint metallic tang of spilled wine. Colonel Blake's body, still draped in the tablecloth, was a grim reminder of the night's turn toward violence. Miss Marple stood near the chalice, her eyes tracing its thorny etchings, when Lord Ravenswood clapped his hands, his voice strained, but authoritative. "We cannot remain here with him," he said, glancing at the Colonel's form. "We'll move the body to a spare room upstairs until the police arrive. Dr. Moreau, Mr. Crane, assist me." Dr. Moreau nodded curtly, while Julian Crane paled but complied, his hands trembling as he helped lift the Colonel. Miss Marple watched closely, noting Ravenswood's careful avoidance of the chalice, and Moreau's quick glance at it before turning away. The men carried the body out, the remaining guests shifting uneasily in their seats. Mrs. Dunley dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "This is dreadful," she whispered. "Locked in with a murderer." "Or a curse," Clara Voss murmured, her voice barely audible, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on her journal. Miss Marple offered a reassuring smile to Mrs. Dunley, but her mind was elsewhere. The chalice, she suspected, was key, not just to the murder, but to whatever game was being played. She stepped closer to the table, intending to examine it further, when Lady Harlow spoke. "Careful, Miss Marple," she said, her tone cool. "That thing is dangerous." "Only to those who drink from it, perhaps," Miss Marple replied mildly, but she noted Lady Harlow's tight grip on her glass, as if anchoring herself. The men returned, Ravenswood locking the parlour door behind them. "The Colonel is in a guest room," he said, "locked for safety. The key is with me." "And the chalice?" Silas Grimm's gravelly voice cut through the room, his eyes fixed on the table. A collective gasp followed as all eyes turned to where the chalice had stood. It was gone. Mrs. Dunley shrieked, clutching her pearls. "It's the curse! It's vanished, just like the stories!" "Nonsense!" Lady Harlow snapped, though her voice wavered. "Someone took it." Miss Marple's gaze swept the room. The chalice had been on the table moments ago, before the body was moved. The parlour doors had been locked, except for the brief moment when the men left and returned. She recalled the rustle of fabric, the flicker of shadows. Someone had been quick and clever. "Who was nearest the table?" she asked, her tone conversational but piercing. Accusations flew. Julian Crane pointed at Clara Voss, who had been seated closest. Voss shook her head, her pale face defiant. "I didn't touch it," she said, her voice steady now. Dr. Moreau suggested a servant might have slipped in, but Ravenswood insisted all staff were accounted for. Silas Grimm said nothing, his gloved hands still, but Miss Marple caught the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth. She moved to the table, examining the spot where the chalice had been. No marks, no residue, only the lingering stain of the spilled wine. Her eyes drifted to the guests' hands, Moreau's ink-stained fingers, Harlow's jewelled rings, Crane's nervous fidgeting. Someone had acted in the chaos, but who? "Lord Ravenswood," she said, turning to him, "you mentioned the chalice has vanished before. Where was it found last?" He hesitated, his jaw tightening. "In the cellar, a century ago, after my great-uncle's death. But the cellar is locked, and I have the only key." "Then we must search the manor," Miss Marple said, her voice firm despite its gentleness. "The chalice is here, and so is the person who took it." Reluctantly, Ravenswood agreed, assigning pairs to search the ground floor. Miss Marple was paired with Mrs. Dunley, whose nervous chatter provided cover for her own observations. As they moved through dimly lit corridors, she noted the manor's labyrinthine layout, hidden alcoves, creaking floorboards, and doors that seemed to lead nowhere. In a shadowed hallway, she paused, her eyes catching a faint scuff on the floor, as if something heavy had been dragged. It led to a narrow door, half hidden by a tapestry. Mrs. Dunley didn't notice, still prattling about curses, but Miss Marple filed the detail away. The Chalice's disappearance was no supernatural feat, she was certain. It was a calculated move, and the locked room where the Colonel lay was only the beginning. As the search continued, she felt the weight of unseen eyes, and her instincts told her the killer was watching, waiting for the next moment to strike. Chapter 7. Secrets in the Cellar. The search of Thornfield Manor's ground floor yielded nothing. No chalice, no clues, only frayed nerves and growing distrust among the guests. Miss Marple, trailing Mrs. Dunley's anxious chatter, returned to the parlour with the others, her mind fixed on the scuffed floor and the hidden door she'd glimpsed. The chalice, she was certain, had not left the manor, and the cellar, mentioned by Ravenswood as the Chalice's last hiding-place a century ago, was her next focus. Lord Ravenswood stood by the hearth, his face drawn. "This is futile," he said. "The Chalice could be anywhere, and the storm still delays the police." "Then we must search the cellar," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but insistent. "You said it was found there before, Lord Ravenswood. History, as I've often found, has a way of repeating itself." The guests exchanged uneasy glances. Dr. Moreau adjusted his spectacles, muttering about damp cellars ruining his notes. Lady Harlow's lips tightened, as if the suggestion displeased her. Silas Grimm's eyes narrowed, but he remained silent, his gloved hands still as ever. Ravenswood hesitated, then produced a heavy iron key from his pocket. "Very well, but the cellar is vast and treacherous. Stay close." He led them through a series of corridors to a stone staircase that descended into darkness. The air grew colder, thick with the scent of earth and mildew. A single lantern, held by Ravenswood, cast flickering shadows on the damp walls. Miss Marple followed, her sensible shoes steady on the uneven steps, her eyes scanning for anything out of place. The cellar was a maze of vaulted chambers, lined with racks of dusty wine bottles and crates shrouded in cobwebs. Barrels loomed like silent sentinels, and the air carried a faint metallic tang that reminded Miss Marple of the spilled wine in the parlour. The group spread out cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the vast space. Mrs. Dunley clung to Miss Marple's arm, whispering about ghosts. "This place feels cursed," she said, her voice trembling. Miss Marple patted her hand, but said nothing, her attention caught by a faint scratch mark on the stone floor, leading to a shadowed alcove. While the others poked among the wine racks, she slipped away, following the mark. The alcove concealed a low wooden door, its hinges rusted but recently disturbed. Flecks of fresh rust dusted the floor. She tested the handle. It was unlocked. Glancing back to ensure no one watched, she opened it, revealing a narrow passage, lined with crumbling stone. Inside she found a small chamber, its walls etched with faded symbols, chalices, thorns, and what looked like Latin inscriptions. A wooden chest sat in the corner, its lid ajar. Kneeling, she peered inside and discovered a bundle of yellowed documents, their ink faded but legible. One caught her eye, a letter dated 1823, addressed to a Lord Theodore Ravenswood. It spoke of a blood debt and a chalice that binds the guilty. Her heart quickened. This was no mere relic, but a symbol tied to the manor's dark history. A noise behind her made her turn. Clara Voss stood in the doorway, her pale face ghostly in the lantern's faint glow. "You shouldn't be here," Voss said, her voice low, almost reverent. "This place holds secrets better left buried." "Secrets," Miss Marple replied, rising. "Have a way of surfacing, Miss Voss. Did you follow me, or were you seeking something yourself?" Voss's eyes flickered to the chest, but she said nothing, turning back to the main cellar. Miss Marple tucked the letter into her sleeve, her mind racing. Voss's presence was no coincidence, and the documents suggested a motive rooted in the past, perhaps a vendetta the Colonel had unwittingly triggered. Returning to the group, she found the search winding down. Julian Crane was complaining about the dust, while Dr. Moreau examined a bottle with feigned interest. Lady Harlow stood apart, her gaze fixed on Ravenswood, who was locking a side chamber. Silas Grimm, as ever, watched silently, his presence like a shadow. "The chalice isn't here," Ravenswood declared, his voice echoing. "We'll return upstairs." But Miss Marple's thoughts were on the letter and the passage. The cellar had revealed more than she'd hoped. Not the chalice, but a glimpse into why it was worth killing for. As they ascended, she felt Clara Voss's eyes on her, and she knew the poet was hiding more than poems. The storm raged outside, trapping them all, and Miss Marple sensed the manor's secrets were closing in, ready to spill like blood from a cursed cup. Chapter 8. A tangled web of lies. The guests reconvened in the parlour, their faces etched with fatigue and suspicion. The storm howled outside, rattling Thornfield Manor's ancient windows, while the absence of the chalice hung over the room like a spectre. Miss Marple settled into her chair, the letter from the cellar tucked safely in her sleeve. Its words, blood, debt, and binds the guilty, echoing in her mind. She observed the others, each a knot in a web of motives she was beginning to unravel. Lord Ravenswood poured fresh wine, though few accepted. "We must remain calm," he said, his voice taut. "The police will arrive when the storm clears. Until then, we stay vigilant." "Vigilant?" Lady Harlow scoffed, her emerald gown shimmering as she stood. "Someone here is a thief and a murderer. That chalice didn't vanish on its own." Her accusation sparked a flurry of denials. Julian Crane stammered that he'd been with Dr. Moreau the whole time, a claim Moreau refuted with a scowl. Mrs. Dunley insisted she'd never left Miss Marple's side, which was true, though her nervous chatter had been little help. Clara Voss remained silent, her journal now closed, her eyes darting to the spot where the chalice had stood. Miss Marple seized the moment, her voice gentle but probing. "Perhaps we might share what brought us here. The chalice, after all, seems to draw those with particular interests. Dr. Moreau, your studies in occult artifacts, did you know of the chalice before tonight?" Moreau stiffened, his spectacles glinting. "I'd heard rumours," he admitted. "A colleague mentioned a relic tied to the Templars, but I thought it myth. When Lord Ravenswood invited me, I came to verify its authenticity." His tone was defensive, and Miss Marple noted the way his fingers clutched his notebook, as if it held more than sketches. "And you, Lady Harlow?" Miss Marple turned to the statuesque woman. "Your passion for rare vintages is well known, but a cursed chalice seems an unusual draw." Lady Harlow's smile was thin. "I collect more than wine, Miss Marple. Historical artefacts intrigue me, especially those with a story. Lord Ravenswood promised a spectacle, and I was curious." Her words were smooth, but her eyes flicked to Ravenswood. A silent exchange Miss Marple filed away. One by one, the guests offered their reasons, each laced with half-truths. Julian Crane claimed he'd been invited to appraise the chalice's value, though his nervous laughter suggested fear of more than a curse. Clara Voss spoke vaguely of poetic inspiration, her voice soft, but her gaze sharp. Mrs. Dunlay admitted she'd come for the prestige of an exclusive event, though her knowledge of the chalice's legend seemed oddly detailed. Silas Grimm, when pressed, said only that he dealt in antiquities and had heard of the chalice's worth, his gravelly voice revealing nothing. Miss Marple listened, her mild demeanour masking her calculations. The letter in her sleeve pointed to a vendetta tied to the Ravenswood family, and the Colonel's death suggested a connection, perhaps to his military past or a shared history with another guest. She recalled his earlier tension with Grimm, and Lady Harlow's whispered exchange with him before the fatal sip. "Lord Ravenswood," she said, turning to the host, "you mentioned your great-uncle's death a century ago, linked to the chalice. Were there other incidents, family secrets perhaps, that might explain why the chalice draws such interest?" Ravenswood's jaw tightened, his hand pausing on his wine-glass. "The manor has its stories," he said curtly. "Most are exaggerated. My great-uncle died of natural causes, despite the rumours. But Miss Marple caught the lie in his hesitation, the way his eyes avoided hers. The letter's mention of a blood debt suggested a deeper truth, one Ravenswood was reluctant to share. She made a mental note to explore the manor's library. Later, old records might hold more clues. As the conversation faltered, Silas Grimm spoke, his voice like a blade. "The chalice is a mirror. It shows us what we fear, or what we desire. Someone here wanted it enough to kill." The room fell silent, his words hanging like a noose. Miss Marple studied him, his hollow cheeks and gloved hands betraying nothing, yet his certainty was unsettling. Did he know more, or was he baiting the others? The fire crackled, casting shadows that seemed to writhe. Miss Marple knew the web of lies was tightening, and the chalice's theft was only the beginning. The killer was among them, weaving their own deception, and she would need to tread carefully to untangle the truth before another thread snapped. Chapter 9. The Second Victim. The parlour's oppressive silence was shattered by a scream that pierced the manor's stone walls. It came from upstairs, sharp and raw, cutting through the guests' uneasy murmurs. Miss Marple's head turned, her calm facade unbroken, but her heart quickened. The sound was Mrs. Dunlay's, she was certain, and it carried the weight of fresh horror. Lord Ravenswood was the first to move, unlocking the parlour door with trembling hands. "Stay here!" he barked, but the guests surged after him, driven by fear or curiosity. Miss Marple followed at a measured pace, her eyes scanning the group. Dr. Moreau's clenched fists, Lady Harlowe's tight-lipped silence, Silas Grimm's unhurried stride. Clara Voss lingered at the rear, her journal clutched like a shield. The scream had come from the guest wing, where Colonel Blake's body had been locked away. Ravenswood led them to the room, his key rattling in the lock. The door swung open, revealing a scene that froze the group in place. Mrs. Dunley stood in the centre, her face ashen, her hands pressed to her mouth. At her feet lay Julian Crane, his sharp cheekbones stark against his lifeless pallor. His eyes were wide, staring at nothing, and beside him, glinting in the candlelight, was the chalice. Its silver was stained with a fresh crimson smear, and a pool of what looked like blood seeped into the rug beneath Crane's body. Mrs. Dunley stammered, I came to pray for the Colonel. The door was open, and I found him. And that thing, she pointed at the chalice, her voice breaking. Miss Marple stepped forward, her gaze sweeping the room. The Colonel's body remained under its shroud in the corner, undisturbed. Crane's body, however, bore a single wound, a deep gash at his throat, precise and brutal. The chalice, returned as if by magic, was no accident. This was a message, Doctor. Moreau knelt beside Crane, his hands shaking as he checked for a pulse. He's gone, he said, his voice hollow. This wasn't poison. This was deliberate. Deliberate? Lady Harlowe's voice was sharp, her composure cracking. The chalice was stolen, and now it's back with another death. Someone is playing a sick game. Miss Marple knelt beside the chalice, careful not to touch it. The blood was real, not a theatrical dye, and the gash suggested a blade, small, sharp, easily concealed. She glanced at the guests, noting their reactions. Ravenswood's pallor, Voss's trance-like stare, Grimm's eerie calm. Mrs. Dunley's hysterics were genuine, but Miss Marple wondered why she'd come to this room alone. The door was locked, Ravenswood said, his voice unsteady. And I had the only key. How did this happen? Clearly you didn't, Silas Grimm said, his gravelly tone cutting through the tension. Or someone picked the lock. The chalice moves as its master wills. Miss Marple ignored the cryptic remark, her mind working through the timeline. The chalice had vanished during the chaos of moving the Colonel's body, and now it reappeared with Crane's murder. The killer was bold, striking while the group was distracted, but why Crane? His nervous demeanour and talk of the chalice's value suggested he knew something, or had been a threat. She turned to Mrs. Dunley, her tone gentle. You said the door was open, Mrs. Dunley. Did you see anyone else in the corridor? Mrs. Dunley shook her head, tears streaming. No, no one. I just wanted to pray. I didn't expect. She dissolved into sobs, and Miss Marple patted her arm, though her eyes were on the floor. A faint scuff mark, like the one in the cellar, trailed toward the door. Someone had been here, and recently. We must secure this room again, Miss Marple said, rising. And the chalice must be guarded. It's not cursed. It's a tool used by someone in this manner. Ravenswood nodded, his face grim, and ordered a servant to stand watch. The chalice was left where it lay, too dangerous to move until the police arrived. As the group retreated to the parlour, Miss Marple lingered, her gaze on Crane's body. His death, like the Colonel's, was tied to the chalice, but the method was different. Poison for one, a blade for another. The killer was adaptable, and the stakes were rising. Back in the parlour, the remaining guests sat in stunned silence. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the letter from the cellar, its mention of a blood debt. Crane, an art dealer, might have known the chalice's true worth or its secrets. Had he been silenced to protect them? As the storm raged outside, she felt the manor's walls closing in. 2 deaths, a missing key, and a chalice that appeared and vanished like a ghost. The killer was among them, and Miss Marple knew she had to act quickly before the chalice claimed another victim. Chapter 10. The Curse Unveiled. The parlour was a prison of flickering shadows. The storm's relentless howl, a grim underscore to the mounting dread. Miss Marple sat near the hearth, her hands folded, the letter from the cellar burning in her memory. Its words, blood debt, and binds the guilty, were no longer abstract. They were the thread tying Colonel Blake's poisoning, and Julian Crane's brutal murder to the chalice. With 2 deaths and the police still delayed, she knew the truth had to surface before the killer struck again. The remaining guests were frayed, their eyes darting to one another with accusation or fear. Lord Ravenswood's polished demeanour had cracked, his hands trembling as he poured water. No one trusted wine now. Lady Harlow sat rigid, her rings glinting as she clenched her fists. Dr. Moreau scribbled in his notebook, his mutterings incoherent. Clara Voss stared at the fire, her journal abandoned, while Mrs. Dunley's prayers were a low, frantic hum. Silas Grimm, as ever, was a shadow, his gloved hands still, his gaze unreadable. Miss Marple broke the silence, her voice soft but commanding. "The chalice is no curse," she said. "It's a tool, wielded by someone with motive and opportunity. To understand why, we must understand its history. Lord Ravenswood, you've been reluctant to share the full story of your great-uncle's death. Now is the time." Ravenswood's jaw tightened, but the weight of the room's stairs forced his hand. "Very well," he said, his voice low. "My great-uncle, Theodore Ravenswood, died in 1823, after acquiring the chalice from a Templar archive. He believed it held power, blessing or curse, he wasn't sure. He hosted a gathering, much like this one, to test its legend. That night, he drank from it and died, the wine turning red. The chalice vanished, only to be found in the cellar days later. The family called it a heart attack, but rumours of murder persisted. Miss Marple nodded, the letter's mention of a blood debt aligning with his tale. And the chalice's origins? The Templar connection? Dr. Moreau interjected, his voice eager despite his nerves. The Templars guarded relics tied to martyrdom and sacrifice. My research suggests the chalice was used in a ritual. It's, Ruby said, to hold a saint's blood. A heretic's curse later tainted it, binding it to vengeance. Those who drink with, guilt in their hearts. He trailed off, glancing at the empty space where the chalice had stood. "Vengeance," Miss Marple repeated, her mind turning to the victims. Colonel Blake, a soldier with a haunted past, and Julian Crane, an art dealer who knew the chalice's value. Both could have crossed someone tied to the Chalice's history. A descendant of the Templars, perhaps, or someone wronged by the Ravenswood family. She turned to the group, her tone conversational, but probing. Each of you came for the Chalice, but your reasons differ. Colonel Blake dismissed the curse, yet drank boldly. Mr. Crane spoke of its worth, perhaps knowing too much. Did either cross paths with any of you before tonight? The question hung like a blade. Lady Harlow's eyes narrowed. You're fishing, Miss Marple. I never met either man before this event. Nor I, Dr. Moreau said quickly, too quickly. Mrs. Dunley shook her head, her prayers faltering. Clara Voss remained silent, but her fingers twitched, as if itching to write. Silas Grimm spoke, his voice like gravel. The Colonel and I served in the same regiment years ago. A minor acquaintance. He was reckless even then. His admission was calculated, Miss Marple thought, revealing just enough to deflect suspicion. She recalled the letter's date, 1823, and the cellar's symbols. The Chalice's curse was a story, but its power lay in belief, in the fear or greed it inspired. Someone here was using that story, orchestrating deaths to settle a score. The Colonel's poisoning required planning, Crane's murder opportunity. The Chalice's movements suggested access to the manor's secrets, passages, keys, perhaps even Ravenswood's trust. Miss Marple's gaze settled on Clara Voss, whose silence was louder than words. Her presence in the cellar, her cryptic talk of rituals, hinted at deeper knowledge. Miss Voss, she said gently, your poetry draws on ancient rites. Have you studied the Chalice's legend before? Voss's eyes met hers, dark and unyielding. Stories inspire me, she said. The Chalice is one of many, but I don't kill for inspiration. Her voice was steady, but her hands betrayed her, gripping her journal tightly. The fire crackled, and Miss Marple felt the pieces aligning. The Chalice was a symbol of a vendetta, its curse a cover for murder. The killer was here watching, and she suspected they were preparing their next move. She needed to force their hand, to draw them into the open before the manor claimed another life. As the storm raged, she began to form a plan, one that would use the Chalice itself as bait. Chapter 11. The Final Gathering. The storm's fury seemed to shake Thornfield Manor's very foundations, its wails echoing the tension within the parlour. Miss Marple sat with her hands folded, her mild eyes masking the certainty that the killer was among them, their next move imminent. 2 deaths, Colonel Blake's poisoning and Julian Crane's brutal murder, had tightened the noose of suspicion, and the Chalice, now locked in the guest room with Crane's body, was the key to unmasking the culprit. She had a plan, one that required the Chalice as bait and the guests as unwitting players. Lord Ravenswood, his face haggard, addressed the group. The police are still delayed. We must stay together until they arrive. No more wandering. Stay together, lady. Harlow's voice was sharp. Her emerald gown creased from hours of strain. Someone here is a murderer. I'd rather lock myself in my room. That won't do, Miss Marple said, her tone gentle but firm. The Chalice has been used to kill twice. We must confront it, together. I propose we retrieve it from the locked room and place it here under guard, to prevent further tragedy. The suggestion sparked protests. Mrs. Dunley gasped, clutching her rosary. Touch that cursed thing. It's brought nothing but death." Dr. Moreau argued it was evidence, better left untouched. Clara Voss's eyes narrowed, her silence louder than words. Silas Grimm, however, nodded slowly, his gravelly voice cutting through the din. "A sensible plan. Let's see who flinches when it's near." Miss Marple noted his agreement, suspecting he was testing the others, or her. Ravenswood, after a moment's hesitation, agreed. "Very well. I'll fetch the chalice myself." "No," Miss Marple said quickly. "We all go. No one should be alone with it." Her words were a precaution, but also a trap. She wanted to watch their reactions, to see who hesitated or moved too eagerly. The group, reluctant but compelled, followed Ravenswood to the guest wing. The corridor was dim, the air heavy with the scent of wax and decay. At the locked room, Ravenswood fumbled with the key, his hands unsteady. The door creaked open, revealing Crane's body, still sprawled, and the chalice, its ruby glinting like a malevolent eye. The blood-stain beside it had darkened, a grim reminder of the night's toll. Miss Marple stepped forward, her eyes scanning the scene. The scuff mark she'd noted earlier was still there, leading to the door's edge. She glanced at the guests. Lady Harlow stood furthest back, her face pale. Dr. Moreau hovered near Ravenswood, his notebook clutched tightly. Clara Voss stared at the chalice, her lips moving silently. Mrs. Dunley clung to Miss Marple's arm, trembling. Silas Grimm was closest, his gloved hands flexed, as if itching to act. Ravenswood lifted the chalice, his movements cautious. "We'll place it on the parlour table," he said, leading the way back. Miss Marple followed, her plan taking shape. The chalice's presence would unsettle the killer, perhaps enough to force a mistake. Back in the parlour, Ravenswood set the chalice at the table's centre, its silver gleaming under the chandelier. The guests took their seats, their eyes drawn to it like moths to a flame. Miss Marple spoke, her voice steady. "The chalice is a symbol, but its power is human. Greed, vengeance, or fear. Someone here used it to kill Colonel Blake and Julian Crane. I believe their deaths are tied to a vendetta, one rooted in the chalice's history." She produced the letter from the cellar, holding it up. "This, found in the cellar, speaks of a blood debt from 1823, linked to the Ravenswood family. Colonel Blake's military past and Crane's knowledge of relics may have made them targets. Who among you shares that history?" The room tensed. Dr. Moreau's pen stopped mid-scribble. Lady Harlow's rings clicked as her hands tightened. Clara Voss leaned forward, her voice low. "You're close, Miss Marple, but you don't see it all. The chalice doesn't just punish, it chooses." Before Miss Marple could respond, a sudden crash echoed from the corridor. The lights flickered, plunging the room into darkness. Mrs. Dunley screamed, and a scuffle followed, fabric rustling, a sharp intake of breath. When the lights returned, the chalice was gone again, and Silas Grimm stood by the table, a thin blade in his gloved hand, his eyes locked on Miss Marple. "You're too clever," he said, his voice a growl, but not clever enough. The guests froze, the trap sprung, but not as Miss Marple had planned. The killer had revealed himself, but the chalice was gone, and the game had taken a deadly turn. Chapter 12. The truth pours out. The parlour was a tableau of fear. the flickering chandelier casting jagged shadows, as Silas Grimm stood with his blade, its edge catching the light like a shard of ice. The chalice was gone, vanished in the brief darkness, but Miss Marple's gaze remained steady, her mild demeanour unshaken. The guests were frozen, Mrs. Dunley whimpering, Lady Harlow rigid, Dr. Moreau clutching his notebook, Clara Voss eerily calm, and Lord Ravenswood pale, his hand halfway to his pocket. "Mr. Grimm," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but piercing, "you've shown your hand but not your motive. The chalice is your weapon, but why? What debt drives you to murder?" Grimm's hollow cheeks twitched, his eyes like dark wells. "You think you've unravelled it, old woman," he rasped, "but the chalice isn't mine. It's hers." His gaze flicked to Clara Voss, whose lips parted in a faint, knowing smile. The room gasped, but Miss Marple's expression didn't falter. She'd suspected Voss's involvement, her cryptic words, her presence in the cellar, her fixation on the chalice. Grimm was the blade, but Voss was the mind. "Explain yourself, Miss Voss," Miss Marple said, her tone inviting confession. Voss rose, her midnight blue dress pooling like ink. "The chalice is my birthright," she said, her voice soft but resonant. "My ancestor, a Templar's daughter, was betrayed by the Ravenswood family in 1823. They stole the chalice, killed her lover, and cursed her line. The blood debt is theirs, and I came to settle it." She gestured to the letter Miss Marple held. "That tells half the story. The rest is in my blood. Colonel Blake served with my father, who died disgraced after Blake betrayed him. Julian, Crane tried to sell the chalice's secrets to a collector, threatening my claim. They both drank from the chalice, and it judged them." "Judged?" Lady Harlow snapped. "You poisoned Blake and slit Crane's throat. That's no curse, it's murder." Voss's smile was chilling. "The chalice chooses, but I guide it. Silas was my instrument, loyal to my cause." Grimm's blade lowered slightly, his loyalty to Voss evident in his silence. Miss Marple nodded, piecing it together. "You used phenolphthalein, or a similar chemical for the wine's blood effect, a trick to fuel the curse's myth. Blake's poison was in the chalice, administered when Ravenswood poured. Crane's death was opportunistic, his throat cut in the chaos of moving the body. You hid the chalice in the manor's passages. Those scuff marks gave you away." Voss's eyes narrowed, but she didn't deny it. Miss Marple continued, addressing Ravenswood. "Your family's history fueled this vendetta. You invited these guests knowing the chalice's legend. Did you suspect it would provoke such violence?" Ravenswood's face crumpled. "I wanted to sell the chalice," he admitted. "Its curse was a burden. I invited experts, Moreau, Crane, Grimm, to appraise it, and Voss for her historical knowledge. I didn't know her true intent." Dr. Moreau, silent until now, stood. "I suspected foul play," he said, brandishing his notebook. "My sketches traced the chalice's movements. Voss was always near when it vanished." Mrs. Dunley, trembling, whispered, "But where is it now?" Miss Marple's eyes flicked to Voss's journal, abandoned on the table. "I believe it's close," she said. Moving swiftly, she opened the journal, revealing a hollowed compartment. The chalice gleamed within, its ruby mocking the room's. Horror! Voss lunged, but Grimm hesitated, his blade wavering. Lady Harlow, with surprising agility, seized a candlestick and struck Grimm's wrist, sending the knife clattering. Ravenswood tackled Voss, pinning her as Dr. Moreau and Mrs. Dunlay blocked the door. "The police will sort this out," Miss Marple said, retrieving the chalice and wrapping it in a cloth. "The curse was a story, Miss Voss, but your vengeance was real. It ends here." As the storm began to wane, the manor's secrets lay bare. Voss and Grimm were restrained, the chalice secured, and the guests, shaken but alive, awaited the authorities. Miss Marple sat quietly, her work done, reflecting on how human greed and grudge had turned wine to blood, far more potently than any curse.